August 20th, 2021. And today we are excited to welcome Preston Dennett. Preston began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomenon. He is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, so MUFON, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 28 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been on Amazon for UFO bestseller. His articles have also appeared in numerous magazines, including Fate, MUFON UFO Journal, and Paranormal Magazine, just to name a few. And he has appeared on numerous radio television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. So Preston will be presenting on his latest book, Wondrous, 25 True UFO Encounters. So thank you, Preston, for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. I'm super excited. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity. All right, can you see my desktop?
Yes, we can. You're good to go.
Cool. Then let me just get this ready to go from the beginning. Let me see here. There we are.
Awesome.
Skipping ahead there. All right, so we're ready to go then.
Yeah, you got it.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jeff. Everyone who helped set this up, I really appreciate it. Like Jeff said in the introduction, I began investigating in 1986 when I found out my family, friends, coworkers were having encounters. I came into this field very skeptical, but after finding out people I loved and trusted were keeping secrets from me, I sort of changed the direction of my life and have now been researching this for 35 years, almost. This latest book is my 29th book, about the 21st about UFOs in particular. And this book I'm super excited about because it's all new cases you haven't heard before. These are people I've interviewed personally and involves a wide variety of encounters, onboard experiences, landings, face-to-face encounters, some sightings with telepathic contact, some government whistleblower accounts that I've been sitting on for a while, but I really wanted to share. So I'll just get started because I've got a lot of information I want to share with you today. Here's all the UFO books I've written over the years. And again, the latest is Wondrous, which is what I'm going to be presenting on tonight. And this is 25 true cases of all different kinds. And one of my favorite cases is actually the first chapter. And it involves a lady I call Eleanor, who had an incredible experience in 1996. This is 2006. And she lived in O'Fallon, Illinois. And each morning, very early in the morning, she would go jogging outside her home in O'Fallon, Illinois. It's a pretty rural area. And she would take her dog, go out jogging around 4:30 a.m. And one morning, she's out jogging, November 2006, and is going down her street, down another street, and comes upon a T intersection. The road is called Kyle Road. And her dog suddenly stops and perks up its ears and looks ahead. And she's thinking she's going to see a deer or a raccoon or some other kind of wildlife, which wasn't unusual. But looking ahead, she saw what she first thought was a man on stilts walking down the center of the road with extenders on his arms. That made no sense. This was, 4:30 a.m. And this was normally a pretty busy road during the day, but at that hour, no one was on it. And suddenly this figure walks right under the streetlight, which is on the corner of Kyle Road. And she gets a good look at it. It's a praying mantis ET. She can see it clearly. She says, judging from the streetlight, it was about 15 feet tall. Not a foot shorter. She's pretty certain about that. She's a school teacher, very well educated, and gave a great lucid interview. And she and her dog just watched this thing taking 6-foot strides down Kyle Road. It had its head bent down and was scanning back and forth as if searching for something. She said it was kind of slate gray, a mottled gray in color, and taking big 6 to 10 foot strides very quickly, marching down Kyle Road. And it completely freaked her out. But to my amazement, she actually didn't turn around and run away. She actually followed this thing, her and her dog, chased after it. And she ran up to the T intersection and saw it just booking down the road until finally it turned into the cornfield there. And it was gone. And she's pretty sure it did not see her. I asked her, is there anything in this area that would attract a 15-foot tall praying mantis? And she said, no, there's really nothing there. There's a high school, cornfields, other homes. But one thing she did mention really kind of made my ears prick up was she lives 6 miles away from Scott Air Force Base. There are a lot of UFO encounters over Air Force bases and military installations. And Scott Air Force Base in particular has been implicated in a number of sightings, particularly 6 years earlier in the year 2000. There was a major sighting in which a giant triangular craft sort of skirted this whole area, going directly over Scott Air Force Base. So perhaps there's a connection there. Hard to say. This was also just around the same time as the very well-known Chicago O'Hare Airport sighting, which a UFO hovered over O'Hare Airport. And that's not very far away. So I don't know if there's a connection there or not. This appeared to be a one-off. At least that's the way she was describing it to me. However, I questioned her because usually if someone has this kind of an experience, close-up entity sighting, it's not a one-off. And after questioning her for a little while, I found out that no, she is actually an experiencer. As a very young child, she had figures entering into her bedroom, short, probably grays, the way she's describing them. She couldn't really see them well because it was very dark. She'd scream, wake up her parents, they'd come running in. Of course, they never saw anything. Happened so often, they forbade her from waking them up anymore. So she was pretty much on her own, as are a lot of experiencers I've interviewed who've had encounters as kids. Their parents generally don't believe them. And one time she did wake up and she wasn't in her bedroom. She was on board, presumably a craft. That's what she described, the rounded walls, indirect lighting, silhouetted figures. She couldn't get a good look at them, but she was pretty sure they were operating on her, trying to, quote, fix something. So yeah, she's an experiencer for sure. And more questioning revealed another UFO sighting over her neighbor's house, very close up. And she did have 2 other humanoid encounters. One is a teenager. She was in the front seat of a car. There was someone in the back seat and someone else was driving. This was in Northern California. And suddenly she heard the child in the back seat gasp. And so she turns to look to her right and a car is pulling up next to them. And she said the person in this car was not human. He was, or she couldn't tell, was almost completely bald except for a few spriggles of hair, very, very pale skin, and had large black pools for eyes. It scared her really bad. She thought, could this be, a malevolent spirit or something? She didn't immediately jump to alien. She now is wondering if it was a hybrid. But it's an unusual case to see something like this in public or driving a car of all things, but it's certainly not unique. I have other cases like it. And some years later, as an adult, she was in Illinois at the Sam's Club, a department store, and had a very similar experience. Felt like someone was watching her, turned around, and there was this same sort of hybrid-looking, bald figure. She said it was dressed strange, but she couldn't remember how it was dressed. But it's the same thing, large oval-shaped head, extremely pale skin, almost completely bald, and large black pools for eyes. So yeah, she's had a number of strange experiences. She researched her praying mantis encounter and did find another encounter about 40 miles away, in which a gentleman also described a praying mantis-like creature crossing the road. It was very similar to what she described, only in his case, he couldn't tell how tall it was because it was on all fours and just crossing the road. So yeah, a very unusual case where a lady out jogging saw this 15-foot tall praying mantis. Most of the cases I get involved in praying mantis are 8 to 9 feet tall, 7 feet tall. This is an outlier for sure, but I did interview another Navy medic who described seeing a 15-foot tall praying mantis. And that was why she contacted me, because she could not find any other descriptions of what she saw anywhere. And now I move to another really interesting case, which occurred in the Nova Scotia area. And this occurred in 2006. A young couple had just moved to a small town. And she was from Europe, didn't speak English very well. And they were having a lot of issues. The house was new, it needed repairs. They were starting a business. They were settling into their house when suddenly she became pregnant. And it was good news, of course, but they weren't really planning on it. And the pregnancy went fine for about 6 or 7 months. Everything was completely normal. They went to the doctor, got blood tests, got what do you call it, with the ultrasound, got a midwife. She sent me pictures of her pregnant and the doctor's reports. So this is a very well verified pregnancy. And it was about 7 months into this pregnancy when something very strange happened. They were driving to a friend's house for a party and arrived a half an hour earlier than they possibly could have. So it wasn't precisely missing time, but there was a time distortion here that really confused them. They were driving, had a period of disorientation, and next thing they knew, they're arriving at their friend's house, and they had no idea what to make of it. And it was at 7.5 months pregnancy when they had a very unusual evening. They were asleep in their bedroom when an electrical storm came over their home, and it frightened them badly because they could see lightning striking outside their window. And it was very strange lightning. It was moving horizontal pathways right in front of their window. The husband jumped up and closed the window, and they ran back to bed and kind of hovered there. They were pretty frightened, pulsing with adrenaline. And next thing they know, it's morning. So that was unusual. And that sort of like puzzled them. How did they even fall asleep when they were both so scared of this storm? And as they're sitting up in bed, they both felt very dazed, almost like drugged. She felt almost as if she was waking up from anesthesia, is how she described it. So they were somewhat disoriented. And she turns to her husband and says, "I don't feel pregnant. I don't feel pregnant anymore." And he's like, "What are you talking about? That's crazy." She says, "Look at my stomach. Does it look, smaller?" And it did. So they were very concerned. And the baby had been in a breech position at this point, and she had been doing exercises prescribed by her midwife to encourage the baby to move into a better position. They thought, well, maybe that's what's going on here. They had an ultrasound appointment like 3 days. So they moved it up to that day and went to the doctors. And the doctors didn't say anything at first. They're trying to find, they're doing the ultrasound tests, and became very concerned and kept persisting. And finally they said, "Well, you're not pregnant." And they said, "What do you mean we're not pregnant?" I said, "You're not pregnant. There must have been a misdiagnosis." And the doctors were upset, of course, and so was the couple that I interviewed. And they said, "How can you say that we're not pregnant? I mean, we had blood tests, we had ultrasounds, we heard the baby's heartbeat over and over again. We felt it kicking." And they said, "We're sorry. There'll probably be disciplinary action. There must have been a misdiagnosis because there's no other explanation." The couple did not believe that for a second. They knew they were pregnant. She had felt the baby kicking over and over again. So they started crying, and the doctor sent them home. And at this point, they had built a nursery and everything. They weren't quite sure what to make of it. The husband was actually more upset than the wife. And I started questioning them about all of this, and I asked them if they had any history of UFO encounters, because they started doing a long search to figure out what had happened to them, and finally hit upon what we know in the UFO community as the missing fetus syndrome, where a woman is pregnant, has an encounter, and the baby goes missing. And they wondered if this is what happened to them. They contacted a number of researchers and finally found me. And so I'm asking them if they have had a UFO history, and they both do. Turns out the husband had seen UFOs twice, so had his father up close. He was chased by a UFO in his car. As we do know, this phenomena tracks families. And the wife said that, yes, she has a history of encounters. She's had a number of instances in which what she described as light beings would enter into her room. She's a deeply spiritual woman, very into crystals, new age stuff, has had a lot of psychic experiences. And in fact, her father was a very famous psychical researcher in Europe. This couple was very concerned about anonymity. So of course I did not use their real names. But as I'm talking to them, they fit the pattern that I see in other cases where this phenomena tracks families. And the wife told me, she says, I think that ETs took my baby. And she was actually okay with it. She took a slight adjustment, of course, but she felt absolutely certain that her baby was alive and being well taken care of. The husband was more upset than her. They had already told both their parents and their extended family, so they had to call each of them up and explain to them that they believed, they didn't, hold any secrets. They believed that their baby had been taken by ETs, and some of their family was pretty religious, so it was difficult for them to sort of adjust to this. Each of the family members reacted in their own ways, but were all very supportive and had no choice but to believe them, because the evidence in this case was pretty, confirming that there was a pregnancy. And that's pretty much how it ended. Unfortunately, I did lose touch with this couple. I don't know if they ever had another pregnancy or not. The last I heard, the husband called me up frantic, weeping, saying that his wife was missing. This was about a month or two after this encounter, and that he believed she had been taken by the ETs. And after I questioned him about it, and turned out they had just had a huge argument, and I told him probably she's just, run off and is releasing some steam, and she'll return, because generally ETs don't take people and not return them. Generally, I will say I do have one or two cases where people have been taken and not returned. But yeah, his wife showed up shortly later, and he called me back super apologetic and a little bit embarrassed, but I totally understood. But this is a really sort of typical case of what I would call the missing fetus syndrome. The only thing that's really different is their child was taken at 7.5 months pregnancy, which is very unusual. Usually when I investigate cases like this, it's maybe 3 months into the pregnancy, 4 months at the outer end, but never have I run across a case where it was at 7.5 months. So this is definitely something that does turn up. I've got cases like this from the very beginning of my research. This is one of the major ET agendas, to replenish their race. And it's certainly not the only case that like this, which is in this particular book. All right, now another case I'd like to talk about took place in May of 1995. To a lady, she gave me the pseudonym Madison, and this took place in New York. They lived in upstate New York and had a number of very close-up sightings. And they didn't realize it at the time, but they were right in the center of a huge UFO wave, what we now know as the Hudson Valley UFO wave, where a lot of people were having very close-up sightings, and there was a huge number of abductions and onboard experiences. And after a few sightings, in May of 1995, the main witness, Madison, had just had a child and woke up and saw three, what she said looked like insectoid beings surrounding her bed. And she was very traumatized by this and started screaming at them. She was concerned for her newborn child. And she got no messages from these guys. They just completely surrounded at her, looked at her, paralyzed her, somehow just using what she felt like was telepathy, and knocked her out unconscious. And she woke up a short time later to someone knocking on her door. It was a friend she had invited over. She couldn't believe she had fallen asleep and all this has happened, because she normally does not go to bed until very late. So she told her friend what happened, and she's like, well, maybe it was a dream. And she's like, no, it was not a dream. I was awake when it happened. And that's all she really remembers of this particular visitation. But what's interesting to me about it is these ETs showed up when she had a newborn. And this is what I see over and over again. People will be, at 8 or 9 months pregnancy, and this is when they have an encounter, or their baby has just been born. One lady I interviewed, she was 8.5 months pregnant, driving down La Cienega Boulevard in California, which is a very busy street. This was during the day. Suddenly all the cars were gone, and a big grapefruit-sized orb started circling around her car. And then it took off, and all the cars came back. The ETs are very interested in human reproduction, and this is a case which, again, fits that pattern of them, researching human reproduction. And after questioning Madison extensively, I found out she did have a history of childhood encounters. Sorry about that noise, guys. But as a young girl, she had an encounter where she woke up and found all these leaves and sticks in her bed and could never understand how they had gotten in there. And now she realized that she had probably been having experiences since she was a little girl. And her son, of course, grew up, and as a teenager, they were watching TV one day, and Grey's came on the program. He jumped up and switched the channel. And she turned to him and says, honey, why did you do that? And he says, I don't know. I just hate those guys. I hate them. So that really concerned her, because he showed other signs of having contact, like in drawings. He would do drawings of relating to UFOs, and had other phobias of anything ET related. So again, here's indications that this is tracking families. She also pointed out to me that following this encounter, she developed a rare medical condition known as hyperparathyroidism. And she's concerned that it might be related somehow to this encounter. And that's certainly a question I ask people: do you have anything medically unusual about you? And often people will describe some unusual medical condition. I will say that a lot of people have reported healings as well. I wrote a book on that, The Healing Power of UFOs, documenting some 300 cases. And I'm pretty much convinced that that is one of their major missions. I don't think this is a nefarious, evil phenomena. I have really no cases involving sadism or torture or ETs trying to, scare you or hurt you. And generally speaking, if a person doesn't have a strong fear reaction, their encounter becomes much more benevolent, and they're given a tour of the craft, shown the engine room, taken to the helm, shown how to fly the craft, given warnings, this sort of thing. There's a very strong spiritual aspect to all of this. Almost all of the experiencers I've interviewed have profoundly psychic experiences. That's a general rule. But that's basically, in a nutshell, what happened in this case. So moving along, because I got a lot of cases. Here's a very interesting case, which was unlike anything I've ever heard before. This involves a therapist by the name of Linda, who I met at Burbank, California MUFON meeting. And we started talking, and she revealed that she was an experiencer and agreed to an interview. And didn't think she was personally involved at first. She had had a few sightings as an adult. She saw a USO off the coast of California. On another occasion, she saw a UFO with her boyfriend. She did suffer from child abuse as a child and was seeing a therapist. And her therapist recommended she undergo massage therapy because this will help release trauma, which is sort of buried in her subconscious. And so she went to a massage therapist, and something very unusual happened during this time. This was around 1983. After going to massage therapy, these weird symbols started to appear on her body. And these were clearly meaningful. They were complex symbols, not a simple triangle or something, which is something I've often heard from other experiencers. These were like letters or symbols. And after it happened several times, I mean, once she was in the shower, she saw a couple of them up and down her leg. She started writing them down in a little journal and got a few pages of these symbols and went to the library to see if she could find what these were. And she could not match them up to hieroglyphs or Sanskrit or anything. She asked everyone she knew. She went to a Masonic temple thinking they might have some information, checked out books on symbology, was never able to match these up. And at some point they stopped appearing. And then one day she's watching TV on the couch with her boyfriend, and this little mini-series was coming on television. And the mini-series was called Intruders, which is based on Bud Hopkins' book of the same name about people who are having onboard UFO encounters. And during this mini-series, people were being taken into a UFO, and she saw symbols on the wall of the interior of this UFO on this television program. And it completely floored her. I mean, her jaw dropped, her eyes went wide because these symbols were precisely what she had been drawing. And here on the right, you can see the symbols, which are taken directly from that mini-series, Intruders. And her husband, or not her husband, her boyfriend turns to her and says, "Honey, look, those symbols, those look exactly like you were drawing in your journal that appeared on your body." And she's like, "Yeah, they do." So that absolutely shocked her. Now she finally had an answer as to what these symbols were, or where they might have come from, or their connection at least to the UFO phenomena. And that really got her interested in the possibility that she was an experiencer. And she started having dreams at this point, dreams about her childhood. And these were very vivid, hyper realistic, lucid dreams, which she felt actually were memories of actual experiences. And one involved her at her childhood home, and she's outside, standing outside her home next to the cornfield there. And there are two what we would call Nordic beings. I don't really like that term. I call them human-looking ETs. And they were on either side of her. And they were sending down this huge beam of light over her and the entire area. And she said as she watched, the cornfield started going back in time, very much like we saw in the H.G. Wells Time Machine movie. Seasons changing, going backwards, the landscape changing, plants, changing seasons, all of this. And she was super impressed, kept wanting to run up and pick the flowers or, play in the snow and so forth. And the beings she was with kept grabbing her and said, "No, don't move, it's dangerous, stay where you are, you need to see this." And this went on for just a short time and finally ended, and that's all she really remembers, except for one other dream, which was quite similar. in which a UFO was hovering over their house and sending down a huge beam of light. She's standing outside her home with her mother, and their mother says, get in the house right now. And Linda says, no, I don't want to. I don't want to go into the time beam, is how she described it. And that was really interesting to me because I've never heard anyone describe a UFO beam as a time beam. But as you know, if you've done any UFO research, these beams of light from UFOs have all kinds of amazing abilities to paralyze a person, levitate a person, render solid objects permeable or invisible, heal people, or for that matter, burn people. And there are all kinds of time distortions, as you know, involved with UFOs, where ETs can stop time or telescope time or condense it or cause missing time. But this was the first case I had involving what is essentially a time beam. I've had a number of cases where people have been shown the future or even the past. So that's sort of what's going on in this case. It's a very unusual case. And I've been in touch with her still. Her encounters have slowed down. She's a very interesting lady, profoundly psychic. She's had all kinds of psychic visions and affects electromagnetic instruments intensely and all kinds of other stuff like that. But yeah, very interesting case. All right, now I move to another case involving a lady by the name of Connie Santos, who lived in the Mount Rainier area of Washington State and had no reason to believe that she was having encounters, but woke up one evening in her multi-level apartment building in a dense part of the city and saw these silver-suited, I would think we would call them grays, standing around her bed. They had like jumpsuits on, like aluminum foil, she said. And it frightened her really bad. She could see this huge bright light. How it actually began with a huge bright light and a buzzing noise coming in through her window. She woke up and thought, my gosh, there must be a drug bust or a helicopter outside her building. This was not a great neighborhood. And she thought to herself, everyone in the building has got to be hearing this. And that's when she saw these silver-suited beings surrounding her bed. She became paralyzed and quite frightened and blacked out. And when she woke up in the morning, she was lying on top of her covers. Her bed was neatly made. Her legs were in an upright position, much as if she had gone to the gynecologist. That freaked her out. She jumped up and she felt fluid running down her legs. That also concerned her. And she quickly cleaned herself up. She did not feel well, but she had work that morning and wanted to convince herself that this was a nightmare, though she clearly knew it wasn't. There was physical evidence. She rushed off to work and started to feel really unwell. She had nausea and diarrhea. Her mouth felt numb. Everything tasted different. She sat down at her computer and the computer blew out. So she called the IT guy to fix her computer and bring it back online and went to use the copier and she blew out the copier. And she called the IT guy. She's like, oh, you know, fix the copier too. And she went to go fax something and she blew out the fax. And so she was having a real bad day at work with electronics. And this is, again, something we see quite a bit. Having these encounters, I think, increases a person's bioelectric field. And she was certainly experiencing this to a very high degree and felt unwell for about 2 weeks. This experience did cause a profound spiritual transformation for her. It's another pattern I see quite a bit. She abandoned her religion and instead became very spiritual and did a lot of research and finally settled upon the idea that she had been abducted by ETs. This was not something she really wanted to believe in. I connected with her through an online forum. She was super excited to be interviewed. She's a very wonderful, optimistic, fun-loving, just really outgoing person. and it was just a joy to interview. And as we spoke, I did find some clues that pointed towards her having childhood encounters. She would often wake up and she was backwards in bed. Her head would be at the foot of the bed and her feet would be on her pillow. Sometimes she would hear loud buzzing noises, which no one else in the house seemed to hear. Her family used to joke that she was an alien because she had a very large head with a huge forehead. And now it wasn't so funny because she's wondering, does she have, is she a hybrid or something? I think that's a possibility, honestly, because we do know that ETs are very interested in genetics, and a number of experiencers do believe or have been told they are hybrids. She has come to feel like her experiences were benevolent. She hasn't had any since then, but she did allow me to use her real name, Connie Santos, and felt it was really important that people know that these sort of things do happen. And I agree. I think contact is far more common than people realize. I heard a quote from J. Allen Hynek that 1 in 40 people have had an onboard experience. J. Allen Hynek is, of course, connected to Project Blue Book. I heard that very early on in my research, and I didn't believe it for a second. I thought that's way too many people. I would know an abductee, and it turned out I did. I did not have to ask 40 people. I asked probably closer to 30, and I found 5 people within my circle of family, friends, and coworkers who fit that profile. And it was just a few years later, in 1991 or 2, that the Roper organization, a survey organization, found that 1 in 50 people have had an onboard UFO encounter or fit the profile of an abductee. So yeah, I think it's far more common than people realize. Another case I want to talk about occurred to a gentleman by the name of Dudley Delaney. I was doing research on UFO healing cases and found his case online, in which he described briefly a healing encounter he had had. He agreed to an interview, and he was born in the early 1940s. He's just recently passed away, but was always interested in UFOs because of the Frank Edwards radio show, in which Frank Edwards talked a lot about UFOs, and that really piqued his interest. He did have a few unusual encounters as a kid, but nothing he could really pinpoint towards being ET related. One involved a beam of light which came right through his ceiling and shined around his room. He never really knew how to interpret that. And another possible incident involving missing time. But it wasn't until he was quite elderly that he had a real interesting encounter. He grew up, he became a doctor and a natural homeopathic physician, a chiropractor. So was very interested in the medical field. I see that a lot with experiencers. A lot of experiencers are people who are doing good work for humanity. They're doctors, they're artists, they're social workers, environmentalists, animal rights activists, musicians, teachers, and he certainly fit the profile. And he had an experience where at the time he was suffering from pretty severe prostate problems. He was in his 70s and woke up one evening to see a figure standing next to his bed. Next thing he knows, he's not in his room anymore. He's presumably on board a craft. He's lying on a metallic table, and he felt no fear whatsoever. He felt that this being was there to heal him. And he described a humanoid, which wasn't quite a gray. He said it just had a very sort of misshapen face. He asked, "What's your name?" And the being said, "My name is June, and that we need to fix you. You have a problem. You have a cyst." And they put him on his side in what is known as the Sims position, sort of a curled up fetal position, and began to probe him. This is sort of the stereotypical anal probe. And he felt a buzzing sensation and some warmth that was not painful. He felt energy pulsing through him, and they said, "We are fixing you." And it was a very brief experience. Next thing he knows, he's waking up the next morning and his prostate problems very quickly subsided. And he is absolutely convinced that he was healed. And it's very interesting to me because he, pretty rare for people of that age to have that kind of encounter. But it does turn up. I have interviewed several elderly people who were healed. So apparently the ETs felt it was important to heal him. I'm speculating here because of his work with homeopathic healing. He did actually write a book about this sort of thing. And he shared his encounter with his family, who was supportive, and found out that his niece was also an experiencer. She pointed to a little scoop mark and said that she had had missing time. And she, like him, believes that these ETs are benevolent. So it's a really interesting healing encounter and one of many I have investigated. I love this next case because it occurred to my sister-in-law, Kisara, who in 1964 was 9 years old and woke up in her bedroom in Woodland Hills, California to see this short, squat, blue-skinned, dwarf-like being at the foot of her bed. There were several of them. She shared a room with her little sister. And she looks up at this being. She wasn't the least bit frightened. And he pulls out these fiber optic looking cables about as thin as a pencil and starts poking them into the soles of her feet. And she's not sure if they actually pierced her feet or just kind of pressed up against it, but it wasn't painful. And she said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We are taking your memories. We are recording your memories." And she said, "Oh, okay." And she watched them for a few minutes and then fell asleep. And the next night it happened again. And the next night. And it happened every single night for 2 weeks in a row. She never saw them arrive. She never saw them leave. But it happened every night. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't tell her little sister because her little sister was having extreme fear of the closet area, which was really interesting to me because this is something that turns up with a lot of abductees, experiencers will have a fear of the closet. I think this is where the ETs will sort of come and go into a person's room. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't even realize how unusual this experience was at the time until as an adult, when she's actually the one who illustrated the cover of my book and many of my books, and did this illustration here, which I showed to other experiencers who were shocked because this is exactly what they had seen as well. One of these short blue-skinned humanoids are one of the rarer type of humanoids to be seen. Most people see grays or perhaps praying mantis or human-looking, but there's another category involving strange humanoids of all types, and these short, squat blue humanoids. Whitley Strieber described them at one point. And I think this is very close to what they look like because each time I showed this illustration to other experiencers, they're like, "Yep, that's very, very close to what I saw." And after all this went down, she and her little sister, after it stopped happening, were pretty upset. She felt like these were her friends and she wanted them to come back. They never did. She and her little sister went to the end of the driveway and looked up at the sky and were screaming, "Come back, take us with you. Don't leave us here. We don't belong here." And we're crying and crying. Her little sister does not remember this, but Christy Kisara certainly does. And she ended up, grew up, married my brother, who was also an experiencer. He has had a close-up sighting, found what appears to be an implant in his arm. And she became a leading UFO artist and pretty prominent in the field. Makes me wonder if the ETs were setting them up somehow, because it's pretty coincidental that he's an experiencer and so is she. I don't know, hard to say, but definitely turns up in other cases, such as this next one, which involves a gentleman from Montana who in 1956 was 12 years old, ice skating with his friends outside his home, and they all saw a UFO. He had no idea what a UFO was. None of them did, but they could see it wasn't a plane, whatever this was. And it was following this sighting, he began experiencing visitations by what he described as cat-like humanoids. He said that it looked like 3 to 4 foot tall, hairless cats. That's really interesting to me because that's exactly what a number of experiencers have told me. This was very frightening for him. He lived in his own room in the basement, and he would have a battle of wills each time this happened and say, go away, go away, go away. And they eventually would. It happened dozens of times until throughout, his teenage years, and finally stopped. And he grew up, ended up moving to Nevada, where he had met his wife, his future wife, and they grew up. Became they were fairly elderly, in their 50s, 60s. They were watching TV one day when a UFO show came on, and his wife turns to him and says, honey, when I was a little girl, I was visited by cat-like aliens in my bedroom. And he said, really? So was I. And that shocked them both. He did tell his parents did not believe him. She also told her parents said, you're just having nightmares. But they both described pretty much the same type of experience. She had much less recall. She only recalled, figures with weird eyes coming in, cat-like eyes coming into her room. Does not really remember them standing around her bed, but it happened over and over again. So here again, we have two experiencers who are brought together in a strangely coincidental way. And it was following this television program that they started seeing UFOs over their home in Las Vegas. Over and over again, they saw them. These were pretty high up, sort of glowing globes, sometimes little saucers way up there. He got his camera out and tried to take a picture of them, but each time he pulled it out, they would flit away really quickly, and he was never able to get a photograph. And one evening, Melissa, as I call her, was very anxious. She felt something was going to happen that evening. She tossed and turned all night and woke up in the morning, and her husband looked disoriented and was strangely tight-lipped and went off to work. And came back from work that evening and said, honey, I have to tell you something. The ETs came again. And he described these same cat-like beings, and again had a battle of wills with them and told them, go away, go away. And this happened a few times again. And finally says, just go away and don't come back. I don't want you here. And they never came back after that. So it is possible to end encounters, usually through just telling them, you absolutely refuse to be a part of this. This doesn't always work. Ann Druffel wrote a book about how to defend yourself against alien abductions. I read the book, and I think the best and most compelling way was, again, just telling the ETs flat out, you do not want to be a part of this. And that ended his experiences, and was pretty much the end of their story. There is one interesting end note. They invited his brother over, and they were talking, and he came out of the closet as an abductee to his little brother. And his little brother was shocked and got a little pale, and the witness I interviewed said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And his little brother said, well, you know how I always was envious of you having the bedroom in the basement. Well, after you moved out, I moved into the basement, and he was just setting it up, and he was down there for 15 minutes when he had an encounter. And the guy interviewed, like, well, what happened? And his little brother says, I don't want to talk about it. All I can tell you is I saw something that was really, really scary, and I'm not talking about it. But it's pretty clear he had an ET encounter. So I guess these ETs were coming back for the husband there, but instead came upon the brother. Anyway, it's a very interesting case, which again shows this weird manipulation where ETs seem to bring couples together. So that's two cases in this book, and there is a third one, actually. Okay, let's move along. The next case I'd like to talk about occurred in Australia, actually, in Cairns, Australia, to a gentleman by the name of Lincoln Hyde. He had no problem me using his real name. He worked for the government and was actually staying in a hotel to attend a conference when he had a very unusual encounter in the hotel room. That fascinated me because I have a half dozen cases in which people have had encounters in hotel rooms, which seems a very unlikely place for an ET encounter to occur. But it is what it is. He woke up and saw a very bright light hovering outside the hotel room. And next thing he knows, he's floating outside his hotel room, or this is what he's perceiving himself as being outside his hotel room, looking into the hotel room itself. It was just a brief flash, and now he finds himself back in bed in the hotel room, and there is a very tall, 8 to 9 foot tall being at the foot of his bed, looking down at him. He couldn't tell what it looked like other than that it clearly was not human. Its head was large. It was very, very tall. It had a bright light source behind it, so all he could see was a silhouette. It's often what I hear in these hotel room cases. And he was strangely calm. He wasn't frightened. And it winked out. It was a very brief encounter, but he's absolutely convinced that he was awake. He thought this was his only UFO experience. He told nobody except his wife. And he said, this is the only experience I've ever had like this. And she reminded him that, no, it's not. Don't you remember you had that sighting as a young boy? And he's like, oh yeah, that's right. He had told her about a UFO sighting when he was like 9 or 10 years old, right in front of his home, where a craft came very, very low over their house within a few hundred feet and moved off. And I've come to realize when someone sees a UFO within a few hundred feet, it's more, dollars to donuts, most likely more than just a simple sighting. A distant sighting, probably just a sighting, but if it's within a few hundred feet, chances are very good there's deeper levels of contact. And she reminded him of a second encounter that he had forgotten as well. As an adult, he was driving along when this ball of light or craft came low over his car and chased him home. So there are memory problems involved with the UFO phenomena. Amnesia is not unusual to be associated with UFO encounters, and certainly true in his case. And I have every reason to believe he was abducted from that hotel room, particularly because he perceived himself at one point outside the hotel room itself. So I'm thinking he was pulled on board the craft, but it was a fully conscious encounter. I think he doesn't remember all of it. He has no plans on undergoing hypnosis, but absolutely freely shared his encounter and allowed me to use his real name. Only up until this point, he had told nobody. So he's really bravely stepping forward, and I have to give him kudos for that. All right, another very interesting case occurred in Ontario, Canada, and involved a lady I call Evelyn. She initially allowed me to use her real name, but then as the book was being published, I contacted her and she says, oh, asking her if she had anything to add, and showed her her chapter. She said, I've decided to go and be anonymous if you don't mind. I'm like, of course not. It's absolutely your prerogative. And she woke up one evening. She had 2 adult daughters, and her daughters were not in the house. She decided she was going to sleep in her daughter's bedroom just for fun. She woke up and there were these grays standing around her bed. And she had never had a history of UFO encounters. She asked her daughters, both her daughters thought she was nuts when she described this. So neither do her daughters have any history of encounters. But Evelyn recognized these grays instantly because they, by that time, were a prominent fixture in culture. And she'd seen them on TV, images of them many times. So she recognized them quite easily. And they were very friendly. She sat up in bed. She wasn't paralyzed. And she said, why are you here? And they said, we are on a mission. Please extend your arm, which she did. She cooperated, and they held out this wand-like device and started passing it back and forth over her arms and then pretty much her entire body and didn't say anything else. At some point, she did stand up, and she believed she was probably taken because the next thing she knows, it's morning. And she doesn't remember anything else, but it was a very benevolent encounter. And it wouldn't be her last. She once was sitting with her daughters outside around the campfire when a UFO swooped down about 100 feet overhead. Her daughters became very frightened, her daughter and her friend. And she said, just remain calm. It's fine. They're friendly. I'm sure of it. And she would later have memories of being on board these craft in which the ETs gave her very alarming messages and told her that the future of our planet is in peril, that there will be a large-scale disasters across the planet. There may very well be widespread loss of life. There will be hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, mudslides, all these horrific disasters. It upset her quite badly, but they told her, you need to know this. And this is certainly the most common message I think that the ETs give, other than don't be afraid, we won't hurt you. If anyone gets a message, it's usually along these lines: warnings about nuclear proliferation, warnings against pollution, warnings against our warlike ways, against greed and corruption, and environmental destruction in some way. And she came away from her encounters with the ability to heal. She says they healed her back. She had chronic back pain, and told her that she had the ability to heal, and she's healed other people of chronic back pain. Once her cat came into the house with its eyeball ripped out by a raccoon, and she was going to take it to the vet, and before she could, it was mysteriously healed. She had prayed over her cat for a healing, and she's not sure if she healed it or if the ETs did. She thinks the ETs probably did. But it's another very interesting case involving very benevolent healings and warnings of environmental disaster, which is a very common theme I see in contact cases. Now here's another very interesting case which occurred in the mid-1990s to a gentleman by the name of David Wassen, who was on a commercial jet aircraft flying over Las Vegas or the Nevada area with his wife, who was working as a stewardess on this particular flight. David had just undergone a very profound spiritual transformation after reading that book, The Celestine Prophecies by James Redfield. And he's sitting in his window seat on this plane, and suddenly a craft appears right next to the wing, about 20 feet away from the fuselage and the wing itself. It was a shiny chrome-like craft, mirror silver, no portholes, and he got an instant message from this craft, which was in his head. It said, this craft is run, powered by electromagnetism using magnetic fields. This was a very clear impression, not in words so much as a very strong impression. He shouted out to his wife, look, and she came up to the window and she saw it too. And at that moment, it darted away. He looked around in the cabin and no other passengers that he could see seemed to have even noticed this. So it was almost as if it was just for him. And he turned to his wife. He's like, you saw that? And she's like, yeah, I saw that. And he says, do me a favor and ask the pilots about it when you get a chance. Because she is a stewardess who's working on that flight. The flight landed and he's waiting outside for her. She had to do all the procedures to close and fix up the plane, and finally comes up and says, yep, I talked to the pilots. They saw it too. And they said this sort of thing has happened before with them. They've seen other UFOs, but we never, ever report them because this is a thing among pilots. They know reporting a UFO can cause all kinds of problems and red tape and government visitations. And Pilots have been grounded as a result of reporting it or sent for psychological evaluation. So they keep it a secret. But it's a very interesting encounter, and I think probably related to the fact that David was very profoundly, spiritual at this time and was able to receive this telepathic message. And this is a message I've heard from other people who have had simple sightings, who are told how these craft work. Some people have been taken on board, have been given detailed instructions on how to build basically free energy motors. I did a video of this on my YouTube channel if you want more info, but this is one of many cases where this message is relayed. So I thought it was an interesting sighting with telepathic elements. Oh, I better keep moving along because I've got so many stories. I'm going to go a little more quickly.